chapter number 4. It is my joy for my wife and here to be with you again. And yes, we have been here many times. I don't remember how many times, but I've always enjoyed being here with your pastor and his family, and with you, the church family of this church. And it's just great to see the blessings of the Lord and what God has done and what the Lord is doing here in this church. And I pray that your days that are ahead of you will be far more grateful and fruitful than the days that have been behind you, that is for sure. And you know what? If you'll get excited about loving God and serving God, it'll rub off on somebody else, I'll tell you for sure. So just get fired up about loving God and serving the Lord. I thank you for allowing your preacher to come over and be with us. He was a part of our missions conference this year. He preached for us on that Sunday. Did a great job, brought a great message. I still remember it about leaving your water pots, and that was just one of his messages, but he was greatly used of the Lord. And I know you're very fortunate to have the pastor and the pastor's wife that you have here. And so just keep on keeping on for the glory of God. Today, this has been a stewardship. This is a time of stewardship emphasis, and I want to talk to you today about stewardship. You know, one of the most important relationships of life is the relationship of a man and a woman to their money. Life is sacred, and since we exchange our life for money, then we have made money sacred as well. Now, I did not say that money is sacred, but I said since we exchange our life for it, man has begun to think of money as being sacred. And that's exactly what you do. In the morning, you will get up, you'll go to a work location, probably most of you, or to a job somewhere, and you will give your life in exchange for financial remunerations is what you will do. And so we exchange our lives for money. Now, whether you read the Bible or history, you never read very far about worship in the Bible until giving and offerings always become into that picture. And you know, throughout the history of mankind everywhere has always worshiped. Everywhere a man is in the world, regardless of where he is on the face of this globe, people everywhere worship something. That's why in some parts of the country they worship anthills. I've been into Africa and I've seen people who worship cows. I've been to other parts where they have statues that they worship. And of course, here in modernized nations such as you live in Puerto Rico and in America and Europe and places of that nature, the great God today is the God of humanism, where people worship themselves and life is all about them. And that is known as the God of humanism. But you know, regardless of where you are, wherever you go, all the world you go to, mankind is always recognizing the fact that his God is worthy of a part of his life. And that's why in parts of the world people give different kinds of gifts. That's why you read about heathen people who've actually sacrificed children to their gods, which is totally wrong and should never be done. But yet, here's the principle. That is, anything you worship, you always believe it deserves a part of your financial remunerations. And God is no different. The God of the Bible is no different whatsoever. And so today, I want to begin today by tracing for you the history of offerings and the history of tithing in the Bible. Now look with me in Genesis chapter number 4, if you would please. In Genesis chapter number 4, it says, "And Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord." I don't know about you, this sounds a little hot to me, and I don't want to hurt people's ears, so you may want to turn me down just a little bit. "And she again bare his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of the sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel he also brought of the firstling of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he," that is God, "had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. But the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth, and why is thy countenance fallen? If you do well, shall not thou be accepted? But if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him." Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not, am I my brother's keeper? Now then, this is the first offering that is recorded in the Bible. We do not know why these boys are making an offering here. We're not told why they are making an offering. And we don't find recorded here that God spoke to them and said, Bring me an offering. I'm of the personal opinion that the reason that they are doing this, that God has spoken to their dad, Adam. And God had told their dad, Adam, and gave him instructions on how to worship God. And worshiping God from the time of the creation of Adam and Eve all the way through the Bible, even at the close of the Bible, offerings have always been associated with worshiping God. And so these boys grew up here. No doubt they had helped their dad prepare the sacrifices. And their dad had built an altar, and they had offered sacrifices up to them. And so it comes time here, these boys are now grown, they have their own lives, their own families, and as their father has taught them to worship, now then they come to worship as well. And so we see here that they begin to come and they begin to make their offerings unto the Lord. Now, can I remind you of this, that everywhere in the Bible where you find worship, you always find offerings. Just go and check me out sometime. It's always there. Biblically, it's always there. And so these boys come and they begin to make their offering. And we see here that Abel, he brought of the flock, and we see that Cain here, he brought of the fruit of the ground. Now, you know, there's been many times people have speculated on why did God reject Cain's offering here. I've heard people say it was because that he did not bring a blood sacrifice. But the only problem with that is the Bible never says that. Now, Arthur W. Pink, a famous writer, said that many years ago, but there's nothing in the Bible that ever says that. But this is what we do know. We do know that both men came to worship God, but we know that while Abel worshiped God according to the prescribed way that God had given them, he was obedient to it, and Cain was not obedient in the way that God had told them to worship God. And as a result of that, when these boys made those sacrifices to God, God accepted Abel's offering because it was according to God's directions, but he rejected Cain's. Now, which once again reminds us that when God rejected Cain's offering, if it was not according to what God said it was supposed to be, God would not accept it. And God would not accept it as an act of worship on his part. And so not only did God reject Cain's offering, but get this, but God rejected Cain's worship. You see, we must worship God. John 17:17 says that we must worship God in spirit and in truth. And you cannot be wrong with God and come into the presence of God and sacrifice and worship the Lord. And so today, I ask you today, are you right with God in your giving and in your worship? And if you're not right with God in your giving, you're not right with God in your worship. Look with me, if you would, please, in the book of Genesis, chapter number 14. We're just going to trace some verses here. We're going to give you some history in regards to tithing and giving. In the book of Genesis, chapter 14, and look with me in verse number 18. Genesis chapter 14, and in verse number 18. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him, talking about Abraham, and said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. And he, that is Abraham, gave him tithe of all. Now here we see here, this is the first mention of tithing in the Bible. Now I want to call your attention to this fact here. This, my friend, is over 700 years prior to the giving of the law. Today I talk to people in regards to tithing, and they all say this: oh, tithing was under the law, therefore it's not applicable to us today. That's a lie from hell. Here's the truth about tithing. Tithing was begun, we know, 700 years prior to the giving of the law. Tithing was established as a means of worshiping God and being right with God in one's heart, because nothing is ever to be more precious to you and more valuable to any of us in our life than God is. And the giving of our finances is an expression that God is first and everything else is second. Right. And when it's not true of that way, I tell you that we do not enter into worship. Now, why again? Where did the idea of 1/10 come from? Did God write it into something and hand it down to Abraham? We're not told that. Did God speak to Abraham? We're not told that. But we do know this, that Abraham gave his tithe. The word tithe literally means 10%. And that is what Abraham did. And why did Abraham give so? And see, in doing so, he recognized the authority that God was greater than himself. He recognized the fact that God owns all things. He recognized the fact that everything that he has in his life comes to him from God Almighty. And thus he gave tithes back to God as an expression of love, saying, God, I love you more than I love these possessions that you have given to me in my life. So he gave tithes an expression of loving thanks and loving obedience. Now again, I remind you that the occasion here that I'm talking about took place 700 years before the giving of the law. Look with me, if you would please, a little farther over the book of Genesis. Go to Genesis chapter number 28. In Genesis chapter number 28, I want to show you another example of tithing in the Bible. In Genesis chapter number 28, look with me here, if you would please, in verse number 20. Chapter 28 in the book of Genesis, in verse number 20. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, if God will be with me, and will keep me in the way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God, and this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the 10th unto thee. Now this is 200 years after Abraham had first started tithing, and this is 200 years later, and now we see that Jacob is also tithing, and Jacob's tithing here is 500 years prior to the giving of the law. Abraham tithed 700 years prior to the law, and all of their children and all of these people that grew up, they worshiped God the same way through the giving of tithes and offerings. Now, go, if you would please, to the book of Leviticus. For time's sake, I'm going to jump way over to the book of Leviticus, chapter number 27. This is where God then made the giving of tithes and offerings the obligation of all mankind legally under the law. Now, I remind you also that Adam and Eve lived in the time of conscience. And that is, God allowed them to serve God out of the conscience. Well, the problem came about because man's conscience was under the curse of the sin nature. And every person that is born under the curse of the sin nature has one thing in common, and that is that all of us are selfish by nature. The flesh itself is always selfish. The sin nature is all about me. Now then, that was true then, that is still true today. And so we see here that God here established the law in regards to tithing. Leviticus chapter number 27. Look with me in verse number 30. This is when God spoke to Moses and told him to write it down, and this is where it actually went into the law. Leviticus 27, verse number 30. And all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. Now notice again, there's the word the tithe. The word tithe means 10%. It is holy unto the Lord. I want you to notice that. It is holy unto the Lord. Now the word holy means separated or sanctified or set apart unto. Now, later on, Malachi said, he was talking to the people, and he said to them, he said, you have robbed God. And they said, wherein did we rob God? And he said to them, in your tithes and in your offerings. The reason for that is God had already established His law that 10% of everything that He gives to mankind, that the first 10% of all of it already belongs to God. Therefore, when I keep God's money, or I keep that which is God's, that makes me a dishonest person between me and God. You see, a part of the problem people have is they want to recognize that everything they have is theirs. That's not true. God claimed 10% of everything that He gives to you before you ever get it in your hands. It is God's, and God really gives you the stewardship responsibility to do with it according to what God tells you to do. Amen. He goes on to say in verse 31, and if a man will in all redeem all of his tithes, if he holds back on his tithes for any reason, he shall add thereunto the fifth part. You know what the fifth part is? That's 20% interest is what that is, you see. And concerning the tithe of the herd or the flock, even whatsoever passes under the rod, the tenth shall be holy unto the Lord. Now, again, we have seen here in the Bible that tithing was set up or was being practiced long before the law was ever about. We go all the way back to Adam and Eve. They worship God through their giving. And one of the high points of every service ought to be during the offering time. It ought to be when I take my money to church every week and I put it in that offering plate, I'll tell you, I thank God that I have the privilege to put that money in the offering. Amen. It represents the fact I've had another week of life, another week of health, another strength of employment, another week of income. It represents all of those things. And I get to give back unto the Lord. Now, so here we see the 10th portion of everything that grew on the land belonged to God. Everything of their cattle and everything that they had, all of it was given back unto the Lord. Now, if you were here this morning during the Sunday school hour, you know God also established what I refer to as a second tithe. One, the first tithe belonged to God, second tithe belonged to the individual. And actually with Israel, every third year they were required to give a third tithe, and that is to take care of poverty and people whose lives were all falling apart. And that was every third year. Now, let me just quickly go over to the New Testament. And I'm just giving you a highlight view of giving in the Old Testament, and now I want to go to the New Testament. Turn with me, if you would, please, to the book of Matthew, chapter number 5. And I want to look at tithing and giving in the New Testament. Now, we understand tithing was over 700 years prior to the law. We see Abraham tithing, we see Jacob tithing, and then we see where God incorporated it and put it into the law of God Almighty. Now, look with me in Matthew chapter number 5. In Matthew chapter number 5, I'm going to pick up reading here in verse number, let's jump in at verse number 17. Here Jesus said, think not that I am come to destroy the law. Did you see that? Jesus just said, don't think that I've come to destroy the law. He said, or the prophets. I'm not come to destroy. I've come to fulfill. Now, do you see what he's saying? You understand what he's saying? You see, people say, well, giving back then was under the law, therefore we don't give according to the law. You're exactly right. Now, what did Jesus say? Jesus said, under grace, if a man is compelled to go a mile, what should he do? He should go 2 miles. Everybody I've ever known who's ever told me they didn't tithe because that was under the law, they always give less than 10%. And that is hypocrisy. Yeah. That is total hypocrisy. And the law was prior to it. Jesus said, by the way, the law that no longer exists for you today and for me today is that of offering sacrifices to take away our sins. That Jesus became the sacrifice for my sins and for your sins and for the sins of the whole world. But you don't ever find in the Bible where Jesus ever did away with the law of tithing and giving. Right. You never find in the Bible where God ever stopped making money a part of worship. You never find that in the Bible whatsoever. But he said here, think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I'm not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law until all be fulfilled. Do you understand that? You see, my friend, we still, God gave it, God set it up, and it's still a part of it. He says here in verse 19, whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments, shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say unto you that except your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. Now, do you understand what Jesus is saying there? I mean, when he compares here of the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, I'm going to ask you to turn over to the book of Luke, chapter number 4, if you would, please. And while you're going there, I'm just going to give you a little extra teaching on the side here. But the synagogue, which people worshiped in during the time of the formation of the New Testament. When you read in the book of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and even in the book of Acts, when Paul was doing his missionary journeys, he would go into the synagogue. Now, the synagogues began during from the time of the close of the Old Testament to somewhere in between that and the time of the opening of the New Testament. That's when synagogues were built. And that's when they started worshiping at their synagogue. Now, in order to have a synagogue, you had to have 10 families, husband and wife and the children, in order to form a synagogue in any geographical area. And so if you moved outside of a certain geographical area, then if you had 10 families that lived there, you could start another synagogue. Well, in those days, all devout Jews worshiped at their synagogue. Now, when you get over here to the book of Luke, chapter number 4, we find that Jesus is going to worship in the synagogue. Now, and I want you to see this. In Luke chapter number 4, people ask me, well, was Jesus a tither? Well, let the Bible answer that. In Luke chapter number 4, in verse number 16, the Bible says, and he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. In other words, from the time when Jesus was a little boy, this is where he lived. And this is where his family went to the synagogue every week to worship God. And as his custom was, that is what they did regularly, week in, week out, month in, month out. They went to the synagogue. He went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and this is very, very important right here, and stood up for to read. Now, you say, why is that so important? Let me tell you why that's so important. You see, in the synagogue, every synagogue had a church treasurer. And in those days, well, let me reference this. Do you remember when Paul was writing in the book of Corinthians, and he said, when you come together, let one have a psalm, let one have a doctrine, let one have a message of this type. Do you remember that? The reason that was because if you were a member of the synagogue, and you were in right standing in the synagogue, anybody, any man that is, in the synagogue could stand up and speak or preach, whatever you want to call it, in the synagogue on the day of their worship, providing that he was a tither. Every synagogue had a treasurer. Every one of them did. And by law, the treasurer monitored the speaking of who spoke in the synagogue. For example, I'll pick on Pastor since he's here. Let's just say today that we're at the synagogue here in Dorado. We're having services today, and Brother Orlando Revere raises his hand and says, I want to speak at this time. He comes up here, and he's going to give us some wisdom that God spoke to him to give that day. Now, wait a minute. If one of you other brothers were here, whoever you are that was the treasurer of this church here, if you knew that he did not tithe, you were responsible for calling him down publicly right there in the congregation, and they would set you down and you could not speak. That was the law of the synagogue. You can read about it. Just, if you want to study the history of the synagogue, you can read it for yourself. But that was the laws and the rules that Jesus lived under. Now then, I want you to notice this. In Luke chapter 4, verse number 16, and that is, He, Jesus, came to Nazareth, there where He had been brought up, and as His custom was, He went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and He stood up for to read, and there was delivered unto Him the book of the prophet Isaiah. And when He had opened the book, He found the place where it was written, And the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because He hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, and deliver deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that were bruised, and to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. And He closed the book, and He gave it again to the minister, and He sat down. And the eyes of all of them that were in the synagogue were fastened on Him. Now folks, listen, Jesus was a tither. Because if Jesus was not a tither, Jesus could not have spoken in the synagogue. Jesus came not to destroy the law. You don't ever find anywhere in the Bible where God destroyed the law of tithing as an act of worship to God Almighty. You don't ever find that. Later on over here, if you want to go with me now to 1 Corinthians chapter number 16, you see how that Paul clarified this doctrine and this subject here for the church. He said in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, As I have given order to the churches, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia. Galatia was a province. He said, Even so do ye. The same teaching I've given to them, I'm giving to you. Upon the first day of the week. You know what day we come together to worship on? The first day of the week. We don't come together on the Sabbath. You know why? Because Jesus rose again from the dead on the first day of the week. And you read the New Testament, Jesus assembled the church on the first day of the week. He said, Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by Him in store as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherers when I come. The whole principle here laid out right before Him, that they were to worship God in these areas in regards to their giving. Now, you see, God makes it very clear that giving is not a burden. Giving in the Bible is a blessing. And God has always made that true, that the fact of giving is as much a part of worship as singing is a part of worship. Yep. But people deprive themselves of their relationship with God. Just like Cain did in the Old Testament. When Cain was not right with God in his giving, he was not right with God in his relationship. And I remind you that when God rejected his offering, God rejected his worship. That's why today we have such hypocrisy in worship today. People today claim that because they go to church and sing songs, they worship God. If you're not right with God in here, you don't worship God. Right. Remember what John said? If we walk in the light as He is in the light, we have fellowship one with another. And the blood of Jesus Christ cleanses us from all sin. And I want to tell you, just as honest as I can tell you, when you're not right with God in your finances, you're not right with God in your worship. You're not right with God whatsoever. You've got to be right with God in every area of your life. Amen. I remember years ago about reading a story, and I just want to illustrate this truth to you. The story was of a church there in western Kansas. And it was a very large farming community where people where almost everyone there made their living as a farmer, a grain farmer as a matter of fact. And this small church was out there. It was only had a small group of people in it. And every year when they would come time to elect a new treasurer of the church, they could never get anyone to be willing to serve, none of the men to serve as the treasurer of the church, because the church always suffered so bad financially. And so every man in the church had taken his turn. Everybody had been the treasurer of the church at least for 1 year, and many of them had done it repeatedly except this one man. He would never serve as a treasurer of the church. And so it came down to the re-election of their officers, and they said, we think it's time that John take a turn at being the treasurer of the church. He goes to church here. He's a part of it. He has just as much responsibility as everybody else has, and we think it's time that he take his rightful responsibility. And so they put together 2 men to go out and talk to John about it. These men went out to John's house, knocked on the door. John came to the door. They said, John, we're here from the church to talk to you. Can we have a few minutes of your time? And he said, yes, come on in. And so they went in, and they sat down, and they said, John, you know it's the time of our annual election of officers. And John, you know that every man in our church has served as the treasurer of our church, except you. And John, every year, since you've been in our church, you have never agreed to serve as the church treasurer. And in our meeting, we just thought that if you're going to be a member of our church, you need to share the responsibility just like everybody else does. And so therefore, we're asking you, we want you to be the church treasurer for the next year. John looked at them and said to them, okay, I'll tell you what I'll do. I will be the church treasurer for the next year on one condition. They said, what is that? He said that the condition is this, that I do not have to give a financial report to the church for 12 months. They thought, well, it's strange, but okay, it's all right with us. They went back, they told the brethren, and all the brethren said, okay, we don't like that, but that's okay, that's what we'll do. So sure enough, John becomes the church treasurer. And over the period of the next 12 months, they made every repair on the church building that they needed to make. They put up a new fence across the front of the church. They put up a new fence in front of the graveyard. They redid so many, I mean, they just did everything that needed to be done there. They gave the pastor 3 raises in 1 year's time. Came time for the annual report. John stood up, he gave the annual report, told them what they had done, what they had spent the money on, and said now we got a little over $10,000 in our general fund budget. Everybody said, whoa! How in the world did you do that, John? John said, well, it was really quite simple. He said, all of you are grain farmers, and I own the grain mill. And when you brought your grain in, I ground the meal, I sold it for you, I kept 10% of all of y'all's grain and put it in the church offering. Let me tell you something today. If every adult who went to any church today tithe, it would eliminate 90% of all financial problems in every church.
Yep.
One of the greatest ways that Satan uses Christians is withholding your money from the work of God, and you join the devil's ball team, and you play on the devil's ball team every Sunday. When you choose to either go to church or don't go to church, but you don't choose to support it and do what's right by God Almighty.
Yep.
You play on the devil's ball team every Sunday. And I know people who go in and out the doors of the church houses week in and week out, week in and week out. And they play on the devil's ball team every Sunday. They strangle the very financial life out of the church.
Yep.
And God is displeased with that. I'll tell you this story and I'll be through. When I got saved, I got saved as a young man. I was 15 years old. And my oldest brother was saved, and my oldest sister was saved, but my sister, just older than me, she was not saved, and of course I was not saved. I went to church because I was trying to date this girl, and her mother said, if you're going to date my daughter, you got to come to church on Wednesday. And I was supposed to go out with her on Wednesday night, and so I showed up at church. And that night, Charlie Harrington, of course, who's in heaven, probably been in heaven now 25 years, a little short guy about this high. He didn't have but probably this many people right here in the whole entire church. And there was me and 2 girls and another guy sitting on one row. We made up probably almost at least 1/3 of the congregation that night. And there's Charlie Harrington. He is preaching on hell. I'm telling you, he is, woo! He's laying it on us out there. And I mean, he's telling me like he preached 2 hours. Now, I know he didn't, but when you're uncomfortable in church, it seems like the preacher always preaches longer. Kind of like some of y'all feel right now. But nevertheless, that night I got saved. Shortly after that, we had a revival meeting at the church. And I got my mother and I got my sister both to go at the revival meeting, and both of them got saved. Couldn't get my dad to go. Could not get my dad to go. And but nevertheless, over a period of years, my dad finally did come to church one Sunday night when I was preaching. I was home from Bible college, and my pastor said to me, "Do you want to preach Sunday night?" And I said, well, yeah, I'd love to preach Sunday night. Well, where I went to Bible college was 12 hours away from my home. And I had to be in class on Monday morning at 7:30. And so, I had to drive all night to get there, but to preach, I said, yes, sir, I'll be glad to stay here and preach. And I got my dad to go to church with me that Sunday night. Had my car packed, and my plan was, as soon as church was over with, I was headed north. But that night, my daddy got saved. Amen. And I want to tell you something, my dad and my mother, they got active in their church. They didn't live there where I was going to church. They lived over in another area. And but this time they had moved, and they started going to a church over there. And they went to church, and they went to church, and they went to church. And finally, I, of course, had graduated from Bible college. I was over there in Mississippi as a pastor at this time. And I go over and visit my mom and dad. And I don't know what happened, but something happened in the church. And my dad and mom quit going to church. Just quit. Boom. That was it. I'd go over there, and once I found out about it, I'd try to talk to my dad. And my dad was a very quiet man. I look like my dad, but my personality is my mother's. And my wife can affirm that, I promise you. My mother, she was never lacking words about anything. She had an opinion about everything. And I would try to talk to my dad, and my dad would say, now, Ricky boy, that's what he would call me. Now, Ricky boy, I don't want to talk about it. And Ricky boy, I'm not going to talk about it. And it really burdened me. I prayed for my dad, and many times I would try to talk to him. I don't know if you've ever had a parent that was not saved, or a parent who would not go to church. They won't, my dad, he would say, now, Ricky boy, we're not going to talk about that. You understand me? We're not going to talk about that, Ricky boy. My dad would not discuss it any way, shape, form, or fashion. And so I just said, okay, Dad, but I will tell you, you're not right, and you're not doing right, and I'm going to pray for you. And I left it at that. And there were several years went by. We were over there, and of course my dad was a country boy. He loved to sit on the porch. And we were sitting on the porch, and my dad looked over at me and said, Ricky boy, he said, let me tell you something. Okay. He said, Mom and I went to church yesterday. I said, you did? That is wonderful, Dad. Listen, as he said, and I went to the altar, and I got my heart right with God. Oh, man. Tears just began to course down my face. I got up out of my chair, and I went over, and I just grabbed my dad, and I hugged my dad, and I said, Dad, I can't tell you, Dad, how that makes me feel. I am so joy-filled right down there. And tears are just coursing down my face. And after embracing him, I got my handkerchief out, and I went back over, and I sat down in my chair. And again, I'm doing all the talking, and my dad is very quiet. And then in just a few minutes, after I kind of got my eyes dried up, my dad said this to me, preacher. He said, you know what, son? I said, what's that, Dad? He said, and this is how my dad always talked about his church. He said, our little church had a good offering yesterday. I said, they did, Dad. I said, that's wonderful. Don't you listen to this? My dad said, yeah. He said, I got my heart right yesterday morning. And I got my pocketbook right last night. And he said, before we went to church last night, he said, I told your mother. And he always called my mother Babe. He said, I told Babe, now Babe, you know the last time we went to church. And you know how much money of God's we got in our pocket, in our bank account. Babe, you go in there, you figure that amount of money up. You write a check out for that amount. And he said, Babe, don't forget we owe 20% of it. And he said, our little church had a real good offering. Amen. You see, I know people who've been away from God for years. You've done everything with God's money. You've gone on vacation. You've had pleasure. You've done everything. And you want to come back and get right with God here. But you don't ever want to get right with God back here. But I'm going to tell you something. If you ever want to get all right with God, you'll get every bit of it right. Now you say, well, your daddy was a wealthy man. Oh, no. My daddy lived in just what we just call a house trailer. That's what my daddy lived in. Had a little porch built on the front, a little porch built on the back. And the land he lived on was not even my daddy's own land. It belonged to somebody else. But he wanted to get totally right with God. And you know what today? Some of y'all want a desire today to get totally right with God. You ought to start tithing, and you ought to get caught up in what you owe God. Let's bow our heads and close our eyes, please. while heads are bowed and eyes are closed. You know, the number one reason why most people say to me they don't tithe. They never say to me, I don't believe it's in the Bible, or I don't believe the Bible is true. I have people say to me all the time, well, you know, I just can't afford to. Which that's a denial of God's ability to provide for you. And I just wonder today, while all of our heads are bowed and all of our eyes are closed, and no one's looking around, and your pastor ain't looking around. I'm the only one looking around. I wonder how many of you would say here today, preacher, I've not really been a faithful tither like I should be. I believe in it. I know it's in the Bible, but I haven't been. But today, I'm going to promise God that I'm going to get right with God in my finances, and I'm going to become a tither in this church. Well, every head's bowed and every eye's closed. That's true of you. Nobody looking around but me, and I'm leaving town tomorrow. Or Tuesday, excuse me. If that's true of you, would you just slip your hand up as a testimony? Just right here before God. God bless you. Preacher, I really haven't been right in my finances, but I want to get right with God, and I want to do what's right for the Word of God. Somebody else? Preacher, I'm going to do it because it's right. See, it does no good to go to church. God bless you, sir. Somebody else? God bless you. You can slip it up and put it right back down. That's fine. Anybody else? Preacher, I've not been right, but I want to get right. Anybody else? God bless you. Somebody else? Says, don't tell them what this church could do if everybody got right with their finances. So don't tell them what this church could do. The outreach you could have in this community. Somebody else? I wonder today, because I do not know this congregation, and I'm talking about giving to the Lord, but let me ask one more question and I'll be through. I wonder, is there someone here today who say, preacher, I've never given my heart to the Lord in salvation? Preacher, I don't know if I were to die today that heaven would be my home, but I know I want to go to heaven before I die. And when I die, I know I want to go to heaven. And preacher, I want you to pray for me that I would trust Jesus as my Savior before it's too late. Would you just slip your hand up? I don't know who you might be. Preacher, I'm not saved, but I want to make my life right with the Lord. Let's stand with our heads bowed and eyes closed. Oh God and Heavenly Father, I thank you, Father, for everyone who's been so kind to listen to this presentation of the Word of God today. And I ask you, dear Lord, to speak to hearts. Lord, only you're omniscient, God. You know every heart and soul in here today. And I pray, dear God, that you'll call men and women to obedience and faithfulness. And God, I just pray, Lord, that they'll be all that you've asked them to be. Bless this invitation, Lord, today. If there are those, Lord, who are here who are not saved, Lord, help them today to come today and take pastor by the hand and just say, preacher, today, I want to be saved. Lord, for those who've raised their hand today, dear God, that they want to make this right with you in their life, oh God, give them courage, give them faith, give them a spirit of obedience to follow through and do what they said today they want to do. In the name of Jesus. While our heads are bowed and eyes are closed, we're just going to sing a verse of invitation today. If God is speaking to your heart, the Lord may be dealing to you about something totally what I preached about. But whatever it is today, the altars are open, the invitation is open to you. Whatever God is speaking to you about, will you come as we sing it right now?
Spoke to your heart this morning. One way or another, He spoke to you. Would you let Him have it? Maybe you need to come right now to the altar. If you're here, you're not saved. You know you're not saved. And the Lord is speaking to you. Or you never made your faith public.